When an empath comes back into your life, the first instinct is often to simplify the moment. We tell ourselves a familiar story. They came back because they still love me. They came back because they regret leaving. They came back because they finally realized what they lost. It is an appealing narrative because it places us at the center of someone else's emotional journey. But human behavior is rarely that simple. People return for many reasons, and the wisest response begins not with assumption, but with curiosity. One of the greatest mistakes we make after a relationship ends is believing that every return is an invitation to begin again. In reality, many returns are not about rebuilding a relationship at all. They are about completing an unfinished emotional process. An empath, perhaps more than most people, understands that unresolved emotions do not simply disappear. They linger beneath the surface, shaping future relationships, influencing self-worth, and quietly demanding attention. Sometimes returning is less about rekindling love and more about reclaiming peace. This is why emotional maturity asks us to pause before we react. Instead of asking, "What do they want from me?" ask a more meaningful question. What might they be trying to understand about themselves? That shift changes everything. It moves us away from ego and toward insight. Empaths often carry a deep sense of responsibility for the emotional experiences they share with others. Even after a relationship has ended, they may continue reflecting on conversations left unfinished, apologies never spoken, or versions of themselves they no longer recognize. Returning can be an attempt to close a chapter with honesty rather than leaving it defined by silence. It can represent growth instead of longing, but growth is frequently misunderstood. We assume that vulnerability signals a desire for reconciliation because we confuse emotional openness with emotional availability. Someone can genuinely care about your well-being without wanting to rebuild the relationship. They can appreciate what you once shared while recognizing that the healthiest future lies apart. Wisdom begins when we stop forcing every emotional gesture into the categories of either rejection or reunion. There is another possibility that deserves attention. Sometimes an empath returns simply to see whether the emotional patterns that once caused pain have changed. Human beings naturally seek evidence that their suffering had meaning. If a relationship ended because of repeated cycles of misunderstanding, emotional neglect, or inconsistent behavior, returning can become a way of answering a difficult question. Has anything truly changed? The answer they discover often matters less than the question itself, because it reflects their own desire to trust their judgment again. Notice what this means for your response. If you immediately interpret their return as validation of your worth, you may overlook what is actually happening. You begin responding to a story you have created rather than the reality standing in front of you. The conversation becomes shaped by your expectations instead of mutual understanding. That is how people repeat the very patterns they hope to escape. The strongest people resist this temptation. They listen before they conclude. They observe before they decide. They recognize that understanding another person's intention is not about granting them control. It is about refusing to let assumptions control you. There is a quiet confidence in that approach. It does not rush toward hope, nor does it rush toward suspicion. It simply creates enough space for truth to emerge, and truth, unlike fantasy, rarely needs to announce itself. It becomes visible through consistency, clarity, and the willingness of both people to speak honestly without trying to influence the outcome. Ironically, this is where genuine self-respect begins. Self-respect is not proven by making someone chase you or by assuming they returned because they could not live without you. It is demonstrated by your ability to remain emotionally grounded even when the past unexpectedly knocks on your door. You neither inflate the moment nor diminish it. You meet it with presence, discernment, and the patience to understand what is actually unfolding. Because the quality of your response depends entirely on the quality of your perception. If you misread the reason someone returned, you will almost certainly misjudge how to respond. But when you take the time to understand before you decide, you stop reacting to your imagination and start responding to reality. And perhaps that is the deepest form of emotional intelligence, not asking why someone came back to you, but asking whether you have become wise enough to see them and yourself clearly. Once you understand that an empath's return is not always a request to begin again, a more difficult question emerges. How do you respond if you know that reopening the relationship is no longer the right choice? This is where emotional intelligence is tested, not in recognizing another person's feelings, but in honoring your own without turning them into a weapon. Many people believe rejection is an act of power. They imagine that making someone wait, withholding affection, or delivering a cold response somehow restores the balance that was once lost. It feels like justice. After all, if you were hurt, isn't it fair that they experience the same pain? But revenge and healing are often mistaken for one another. They may look similar for a moment, yet they lead to entirely different destinations. The desire to punish usually has very little to do with the other person. It is our own unresolved hurt searching for validation. When we have not fully processed disappointment, betrayal, or abandonment, we begin to believe that someone else's suffering will finally make our own pain disappear. Yet, psychological research and lived experience suggest the opposite. Every act of retaliation quietly keeps us emotionally connected to the very experience we claim to be leaving behind. This is especially important when dealing with an empath. Empaths are often highly attuned to emotional undercurrents. They notice the silence between words, the hesitation in your voice, the distance behind a polite smile. If your rejection is driven by resentment instead of clarity, they will likely sense it. And whether they respond with guilt, sadness, or acceptance is no longer the point. What matters is that your own emotional state remains anchored in conflict rather than peace. Healthy boundaries are frequently misunderstood because they are quieter than revenge. They do not demand attention, they do not seek applause, they simply communicate reality. There is an enormous difference between saying, "You don't deserve another chance," and saying, "I have realized that this relationship is no longer healthy for me." The first statement is centered on judgment. The second is centered on responsibility. One attempts to define another person's worth. The other simply defines your own limits. That distinction changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Boundaries are not walls built to punish people. They are structures built to protect what has become valuable within you. Every difficult experience teaches us something about our emotional needs, our capacity for trust, and the conditions under which we are able to thrive. If those lessons mean choosing not to reconnect, then saying no is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of integrity. Integrity rarely feels dramatic. In fact, it often feels disappointingly ordinary. It sounds like speaking honestly without exaggeration. It looks like listening without making promises you cannot keep. It means resisting the temptation to leave someone confused simply because certainty feels uncomfortable. Many people avoid direct rejection because ambiguity appears kinder. They say things like, "maybe someday," or "let's see what happens," even when they already know their decision. They hope uncertainty will soften the impact, but uncertainty often prolongs pain far more than honesty ever could. False hope is one of the most subtle forms of emotional harm because it delays the very healing both people need. Clarity, even when painful, is an act of respect. It tells another person, "I trust you enough to handle the truth." It also tells yourself, "I value my peace enough to stop negotiating with a decision I have already made." Notice that none of this requires emotional coldness. Compassion and firmness are not opposites. In fact, they strengthen each other. You can acknowledge the importance of someone in your life while still recognizing that your paths no longer belong together. You can appreciate what the relationship taught you without feeling obligated to continue it. Gratitude does not require reunion. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of emotional maturity. Sometimes the kindest response is not another chance. Sometimes the greatest expression of care is refusing to recreate a dynamic that both people have already outgrown. When your decision comes from self-awareness instead of resentment, something remarkable happens. You stop trying to prove that you have changed because your behavior already reflects it. You no longer need dramatic speeches, emotional victories, or the satisfaction of watching someone regret losing you. Your peace becomes evidence enough, and perhaps that is the clearest measure of growth, when your boundaries are no longer built to keep someone else out, but to ensure that you never have to abandon yourself again. When we think about the end of a relationship, we often imagine that the most important moments happened somewhere in the middle: the arguments, the disappointments, the affection that slowly faded, or the decision to walk away. Yet relationships are remembered differently than they are lived. What stays with us is often not the entire story, but the emotional meaning of its ending. The final conversation, the last act of kindness, the final expression of honesty. These moments have an extraordinary ability to shape how we carry the experience into the future. This is why the way you respond when an empath comes back matters far beyond that single interaction. You are not simply deciding whether to say yes or no. You are deciding what kind of memory both of you will leave with. More importantly, you are deciding what kind of person you become through the decision. There is a temptation, especially after emotional pain, to believe that closure is something another person gives us. We wait for the perfect apology, the perfect explanation, or the perfect acknowledgement of what happened. We imagine that if they finally understand our pain, then we will finally be free of it. But emotional freedom rarely arrives through another person's realization. It comes through our own. The philosopher once observed that we cannot control events, only our response to them. While relationships are deeply emotional, this insight remains profoundly relevant. The final chapter of any connection is ultimately written by the choices we make after certainty becomes impossible. We cannot force another person to understand us completely. We cannot rewrite the past. We cannot recover the years that have already passed. But we can decide whether the past continues to dictate the quality of our future. This is where emotional responsibility becomes more valuable than emotional certainty. Imagine meeting someone who once held a significant place in your life. There is history between you. There are memories that still carry warmth, alongside moments that still carry pain. It would be easy to become trapped in comparison, measuring who changed more, who suffered longer, or who deserves forgiveness. Yet those questions rarely produce wisdom. They simply keep us negotiating with a past that no longer exists. A healthier question is remarkably simple. Who do I choose to be in this moment? That question shifts your attention away from controlling another person's reaction and toward shaping your own character. It reminds you that every interaction is an opportunity to practice the values you claim to hold. If you believe in honesty, speak honestly. If you believe in compassion, respond compassionately. If you believe in self-respect, let your boundaries reflect it. Character is not revealed during comfortable moments. It becomes visible precisely when emotions tempt us to abandon it. One of the quiet tragedies of unresolved relationships is that people often leave carrying unnecessary burdens. One person carries resentment, the other carries guilt. Sometimes both carry confusion. These emotional weights do not disappear simply because contact ends. They find new relationships, new conversations, and new fears through which to express themselves. That is why closure should never be confused with winning. There is no victory in making someone feel small. There is no triumph in proving that you have become emotionally unavailable simply because someone once failed to understand you. Those responses may protect the ego for a moment, but they rarely strengthen the heart. Real closure is surprisingly humble. It is the ability to look at someone who once mattered deeply and recognize that gratitude and distance can exist together. It is accepting that two people can genuinely influence each other's lives without being meant to continue walking the same path. Some relationships are not failures because they ended. They succeed by teaching us what we needed to learn before we were capable of becoming the people we are today. Perhaps that is the hidden purpose of every meaningful ending. It interrupts the illusion that love alone is enough. It teaches us that compatibility, timing, accountability, and emotional maturity matter just as much. It reminds us that caring for someone and choosing a future with them are not always the same decision. And when an empath returns, your response becomes part of that lesson. If you answer with clarity instead of confusion, dignity instead of retaliation, and compassion instead of pride, you allow the story to end without creating another wound that either of you must spend years healing. In the end, every goodbye becomes a mirror. It reflects not only what the relationship was, but who you have chosen to become because of it. The greatest measure of growth is not whether someone comes back. It is whether, when they do, your response is guided by wisdom instead of old pain. Because the way you close one chapter quietly determines the kind of life you are prepared to begin in the next.